Welcome to another exciting episode of FEMKAST, the podcast that celebrates the achievements and stories of remarkable women. I'm your host, Ilina Pejoska Zaturoski, and today we have a truly inspiring guest with us, Natalie Sekulovska. She's an accomplished journalist and former radio host who has spent years delivering news to audiences across the airwaves. She currently works as a prominent figure at Sky News Australia, one of the world's leading news media organizations. But there's more to Natalie than just her impressive career. She is deeply connected to her Macedonian heritage. And today we'll dive into her experiences, aspirations, and the fascinating journey that has led her to where she is today. Natalie, welcome to FEMKAST.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So can you tell us more about your journey as a journalist and what initially drew you to this profession?
Yeah, so I started my journalism career in print as a writer and an editor, but I always knew I wanted to work in broadcast, so radio and TV. So when I graduated from journalism school, I was working part-time for a legal publication, and at the same time, I was volunteering at two radio stations as a news presenter and a producer at the same time. So luckily that paid off, and I did manage to get my first job as a news presenter at a commercial radio station. I eventually then moved to the Australian Radio Network, which owns a few of the most popular radio stations in Australia. And I worked there for a few years before becoming a journalist at Sky News Australia, where I now produce my own show about news and current affairs. So I guess what initially drew me to journalism was that I love helping other people share their stories. And I think you would understand that, obviously, having your own podcast and sharing my story today. I think it's just so important to give people a platform to be able to open up about the positives and the negatives and the challenges, important to share their experiences, their hardships, and also their achievements. And I think journalism can help do that.
Yeah, I agree so much, especially about the part about giving people a platform. That is, I think, especially in today's world, when everyone is online trying to share something, but often we get misguided by the really important stuff. So journalism can really help that people get that platform that they deserve for the most important things. So with a background in radio hosting, how did you transition into your role at Sky News? Was it difficult for you? Was it a challenge? And what were some of the challenges that you faced along the way?
I actually found that transition from radio news presenting to producing TV quite refreshing. It was something different. At that point, when I made that transition, I had been on air for about 5 years. And while I really enjoyed it, it was challenging to a certain extent. You always had to be happy, or you always had to be switched on, because you're putting a show on for your audience. And especially it's difficult when you're working on very serious and troubling stories sometimes, which always pop up in news and current affairs topics. So it was actually nice to step back a little bit and actually work behind the scenes as a producer and not constantly be on air all the time. That's not to say that I don't miss it. I hope to return to air one day and hopefully continue news presenting, whether it's on radio or TV. But I think for now I'm happy where I'm at, and I actually really enjoy not just being the face of a show or a program, but being able to help behind the scenes and actually produce it and put it together.
Yeah. So you are Macedonian, and you have a really strong connection to your Macedonian heritage. Could you share more about your family's story and which generation of Macedonians you and your family are in Australia? And how did it happen that, so if you're born in Australia, how did it happen that your ancestors ended up in Australia? Can you share more about that?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. So I'm second generation. So that means that both of my parents were born in Macedonia in Bitola. So they migrated to Australia when they were quite young. I think my mum was about 6 years old. So she came to Australia just as she was kind of starting primary school. My father and his parents, so my grandparents, they actually returned to Macedonia when he was a bit older. So he came to Australia when he was 2 years old, stayed here for primary school, and then went back to Macedonia for high school, and then actually studied university in Croatia. Before traveling to Australia, where he met my mum, and obviously they got married and he stayed. So as for my mum, she's lived in Sydney ever since she was 6 years old. But both of my parents, they have a very strong connection to Macedonia, obviously having been born there. So there was always something familiar to me and to my sister about Macedonia and, about being Macedonian. And I think whenever I'm asked, what's your background in Australia, I always say I'm Macedonian. So I always kind of consider myself to be equally Macedonian and Australian, even though I was born here in Sydney in Australia. I've always just considered myself to be both. And to a certain extent, I would consider myself to be maybe a little bit more Macedonian than Australian, just because I have that connection to Macedonia. I also grew up, speaking Macedonian with my grandparents because they didn't know a lot of English. I used to go to Macedonian dancing with my baba, and, the Barbie growing up, they always used to make, the Macedonian food like, marsnik and pogača and, graf. And so that whole culture of being Macedonian was always around me. So I never kind of felt that disconnect to my Macedonian heritage, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolute sense. I mean, I've never lived outside of Macedonia for more than a month, so it's very interesting to me how our diaspora in all over the world is actually embracing our culture even more than people who live here, like the folklore, the culture, and everything. Because you guys attend all of those dances and attend classes for the dances and stuff like that. And here there was a time when those things were ridiculed especially by younger generations, which I never really fully understood, because I think that everyone should be proud of wherever they come from. And I sometimes feel that people who live in Australia and in other parts of the world, our diaspora in general, are more proud to be Macedonian than the people who live here, if you know what I mean.
That's probably, I wouldn't say more proud, but I think it's just more kind of willingness to kind of hold on to that heritage, because we already feel geographically, I think, disconnected from the country. And so we'll kind of try and keep and protect anything culturally that we can. And, it has been hard for me, even though I still do speak Macedonian with, primarily my grandparents, because I don't necessarily speak it all the time with my parents or, with my friends, even my sister. It's much harder for me to, I think, speak in Macedonian sometimes because I don't use it as often. So whenever I am with my grandparents, I'm trying to use it as much as possible, just so I can obviously, protect, that part of my heritage. But I think it is an interesting kind of relationship that you bring up, with Macedonia and the diaspora. I think it is because we do feel that distance. It is harder for us to kind of feel connected sometimes, so we try harder. But yeah, like my parents have always told me stories about, growing up and at school, they were ridiculed or they were made fun of, by people or young kids, about, their Macedonian heritage. But I don't think we experience that as much in Australia anymore. But I can see how it was hard to kind of maintain that connection to Macedonia.
Okay, so have you ever had the opportunity to visit Macedonia? And if so, what were your experiences like?
Yes, so I have visited Macedonia just once, unfortunately. So when I was about, I think it was 12 or 13 years old. So it felt so familiar to me. Even though, I've only been once and, I'd never been there before, it felt familiar because of my experience, with my grandparents and my parents growing up. So, it was easier to get around because I do have that basic understanding of Macedonian. And it was actually really nice to meet my family from both sides as well, family that I'd never met before. I even got to meet my great-grandparents on my dad's side, which was so nice because, you know, growing up, my grandparents had told me so many stories about them. So to actually meet them, you know, in person was incredible. And then a couple of years later, they passed away. So to be able to actually meet them in, you know, the country, you know, where my family originated, you know, before they passed away, that was just an incredible experience for me. And, you know, it's a shame that I've only traveled there once. You know, I would like to return soon and actually see more of the country. I think I was quite young, but I do regret last time not sightseeing more, because I feel there's just so much, you know, kind of sightseeing to see, and there's so much more to the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it probably has changed so much since the last time you were here. So I think that you will like it even more, especially during this time and age. So you should visit definitely as soon as possible. So let's go back to your journalism career. So what have been the most memorable moments in your journalism career so far, particularly during your time at Sky News Australia?
So when I was a freelance journalist, I think it was back in 2018. So I actually produced a radio story about the controversy surrounding the Macedonian name. So I feel like it impacted, and still to a certain extent, it impacts, you know, a lot of Macedonians in Australia. So back then, you know, we had protests in Sydney and Melbourne, and I think there was a lot of frustration in the diaspora. And I think it goes back to that feeling of feeling disconnected from your country because you are so far away. So anything that relates to Macedonia or your heritage, you want to protect. So people were quite frustrated about it and they wanted to speak about it, but the mainstream media, which I now work in, wasn't talking about it enough. So I wrote about the issue, and I did this radio story in the hopes that it would actually expose what was going on. That's probably been my highlight, just because it is a topic that, you know, I was very passionate about, and I'm obviously still very passionate about now. I think another highlight for me would probably be just seeing how proud the Macedonian community was of my radio achievements. So for a bit of context, we don't actually have a lot of news presenters in Australia that are of Macedonian heritage. So it was just so nice to receive so many positive, you know, like messages and comments about my news presenting, because people were able to recognize my last name on air. So that was really nice. And I just hope that, you know, that kind of representation encourages more Macedonians in Australia and in other parts of the world to enter journalism and, you know, to aim for those on-air roles, which they might think that they can't achieve or that they might not be able to reach.
Thank you for sharing. This is actually very important what you did, especially because you still weren't working in mainstream media, as you said, and you had that impact. And we need more people like you to share what's going on in Macedonia, especially throughout the world. Looking ahead, what are your future career aspirations and goals within the field of journalism?
Yeah, so I think I would love to stay in TV. I loved radio, but I think I'm really enjoying TV at the moment, and I would love to work on documentaries or, you know, feature films, not necessarily, you know, in news or current affairs, but, you know, I love food, I love traveling, I love art, I love culture as well. So I think it'd be fun to kind of venture into those topics as well. And also just to have a little bit more freedom in the kind of topics that, you know, I can talk about and that I can share, and, you know, specifically pertaining, you know, to Macedonia and the issues kind of surrounding Macedonia. And as much as I really like that adrenaline of working in a fast-paced newsroom, I think it would be nice to actually slow down a little bit and just work on projects at my own pace as well, and just have that freedom to kind of work on projects that I actually really enjoy.
And so have you had a chance to work on something different than producing ever since you started working for Sky News Australia?
Yeah, I think it's definitely opened the door to working on, particular topics that I'm passionate about. So, for example, when I was a news presenter, we had to remain quite objective, when it came to kind of presenting news. And it was also very local. So because I'm based in Sydney and the radio stations were broadcasting in Sydney, I had to talk about topics or issues that were affecting Sydney. Whereas at Sky News, we have a little bit more freedom to explore topics that are more national on kind of like an Australia-wide level or international as well. So talking about very important international issues. So working at Sky, I've kind of broadened the scope of topics and issues that I've been able to kind of explore and in more detail.
So beyond your career, can you share some of your hobbies and interests that keep you grounded outside of work?
Yeah, I guess this is kind of still related to my work a little bit because I can never kind of fully detach from work, which isn't 100% great, but I love reading, which obviously, makes sense as, being a journalist and a writer. I used to love fiction and I still do, but I'm starting to read a lot more non-fiction these days, just to kind of inform myself on issues that I'm not necessarily across or I'd like to learn more about. So that's kind of how I spend my downtime. I do a lot of reading. I'm also a singer as well. So love singing. I don't do that as much as I would like to, but it's great.
So that is new information to me. I did not know that you that you sing. So now I'd like you to share more about that. How did that start? And have you always been singing? Have you sang on some Macedonian conventions and stuff like that? Do you enjoy that? So you have to share more.
There is still a link to Macedonia and to my family. So it all started because my dad's a singer as well. He's probably not happy that I'm going to share this, but he's an incredible singer. And he was actually part of a band in Macedonia, which would kind of go around and perform at events and perform at occasions. So he was always kind of my inspiration growing up, and I thought, well, if he can do it too, then I can. So that's kind of where my inspiration for singing came from. And when I was younger, so primarily in high school and while I was still at university, I used to perform at, events around Sydney, and I used to even try and write my own songs, but that didn't work out too well. So I just stuck to singing. I don't do it as much publicly anymore, but I would love to kind of, I think, get back into it and actually start learning more Macedonian songs. I primarily sing in English, but I'd love to learn Macedonian songs and actually be able to perform them in public as well.
That is so nice that you followed your dad's footsteps regarding that. And I'm always so happy when a child actually follows in his dad's footsteps, especially when it comes to creative profession. And I do you think that seeing your dad perform publicly like that has also inspired you to start a career as a public person, like in journalism? Has that had that impact on you?
I think so, yes. Just because, I always used to see my dad performing, primarily at weddings. So even if he wasn't the designated wedding singer, he would always get up because everyone knew he could sing. And he would always, perform a few songs. And so I think definitely I was inspired by that, and I've just always loved performing. Like I used to perform in theater and in plays and musicals growing up, and so definitely that performance aspect, I think I've learned from my dad, and he's kind of, I think, pushed me and motivated me and given me that confidence to still perform, but in a different way for my career, in kind of news presenting and journalism, more so than like, the singing and the acting, although I still enjoy that.
I love that. Way to go, Dad. He gave you the confidence to be whoever you wanted to be. I mean, he set the base and you just grew from there. I love that.
Yeah, no, he definitely did.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. That was very nice to hear. So tell me, so as someone who has achieved so much in your career, what advice would you give to young women aspiring to make a mark in the world of journalism, especially women, Macedonian women who live abroad? So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think journalism is just very hard to get into in the first place. So my number one tip would be, and I wish I did more of this, was just start early. So even if you're still in journalism school, start freelancing, start pitching your own ideas to publications and broadcasters. Take the initiative. Don't just wait, for someone to give you a job, or, for a publisher or a broadcaster, to open up applications for a particular role. Just reach out, whether it's, calling them or emailing them, calling these places that you want to work at, and, see if there are any jobs available. I found in my own experience that, employers, especially in a journalism field, they really appreciate that initiative. And what's the worst that can happen? They'll come back to you and say they don't have a job available, but at least that way you've contacted them, you've given them your name, you've potentially given them, your resume and your portfolio of work. They'll remember you, for next time if a job comes up. That's happened to me a couple of times. And don't be afraid to put yourself out there, because the more content you create, the more exposure you get. So I was actually, from my radio job to now my TV job, I was actually headhunted, which meant that someone had heard me on radio and said, hey, she's really great, called me up and said, do you want a job here? So I think the more you kind of push yourself and the more you get your name out there, the more they'll actually see you, and they'll want you in a particular role. Journalism and media, the industry, is all about being bold and just making yourself be seen and heard.
That is great advice, especially when we have so many people who want to do something, want to start their career, especially in journalism, but they're too afraid of being judged. You know how it is, because everything is public these days. So I love that advice that you just gave everyone, that they should just start somewhere, initiate, and send whatever they have, their materials, to wherever they want to work in. That is great advice. So fun fact about me, I also had a radio show 13 years ago. So I have my own experience with radio. I forgot to mention that. It was actually during the summer between my first and second year of college, and yeah, it was fun. So it wasn't as professional as the job that you had, but it was a great experience for me to build my confidence and actually maybe set the base for everything else that I did from then on.
What did you used to speak about on your radio show? What was it all about?
It was pop culture mostly. So
no.
yeah, it was very, very lightweight. So
you know what? We all have to start somewhere, and I think that's maybe like another thing, like another tip. I think, we all have to start somewhere. We all have to, I started in community radio, which was probably kind of equivalent of what you were doing. So you can kind of afford to make mistakes, or you can afford to use that as a learning experience. So yeah, like that kind of goes back to my point about just getting yourself out there, not being too afraid to kind of build up your confidence, and then moving on to bigger things after that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Finally, what message or words of inspiration would you like to share with our listeners, especially those who may be facing challenges or pursuing their own dreams?
Yeah, so I think along, kind of my personal journey, but also kind of my career journey as well, I've kind of learned that people will respect you a lot more when you actually, you have opinions, you stand up for yourself, you have that confidence in your abilities. I think as women, and especially as, young women, we often put ourselves down, or, we think that we're not good enough, and I'm still guilty of doing that to a certain extent. But I think working in journalism has kind of brought me out of my shell a little bit. So I think that's probably the biggest tip that I, can give to your listeners. And it is just putting yourself out there, and not being afraid about having experiences, because those will make you a better journalist, or will make you a better whatever you want to be for the future. So yeah, just put yourself out there and grow that confidence, and that potential that you have.
That is apologies. That is great advice. So, Natalie, thank you so much for being with me today and for sharing your incredible journey with my audience on FEMKAST. I am truly honored to have had you as my guest, and I hope that we can have you as my guest in the future. Maybe when you move from producing and continue on your journalism journey in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll see what I'll be doing in the next couple of years, or whenever we're talking again. But thank you. It's been an absolute privilege having a chat with you today, and hopefully your listeners will be able to get something out of what I've said, whether they want to be journalists, or they want to work in a different industry or field.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.